Irony is the defining technique of romantic literature. That's why I'm having you examine it in your papers to learn how romanticism works, how it communicates with readers. Um, but technique is not the ultimate concern of romanticism. Romanticism's ultimate concern is freedom, human freedom, the new sense of self, and the new sense of the authority of individual experience ushered in by the French Revolution, American and French revolutions. Um, Irony serves romanticism uh, to explore freedom, explore the freedom to create new ways of writing and new ways of reading. So we saw in Jane Austen the invention of a new kind of narration, the invention of the modern style of novel. Uh, um, and uh, and that's to say also the invention of a new kind of reader. Um, Austen teaches us how to read her. Um, Wordsworth famously said that artists create the taste by which they are enjoyed. So, to enjoy an artist is to learn a new taste, a new way of enjoying. Um, I, that's the romantic metaphor of growth. We, just like we saw in Jane Austen, those two stages of love. Um, to fall in love is not just to find an appropriate love object, but to learn how to love in a way to be kind of punished and instructed by experience. And that's true of the experience of reading. That we have to struggle to find our footing, our orientation amongst the ironies of a Jane Austen novel. And that's true also of Blake, that he's creating uh, wildly new kinds of writing in order to create new kinds of readers. Um, so, again, what do I mean by what does irony mean? In Jane Austen and in Blake, it means reading uh, language um, as active, as that is to say, not just reading language, not just for its propositional content, not just for its semantic content, um, but reading language as an active expression of a particular perspective. So when we read Austen, um, what we're getting instructed in is being able to see different ways of expressing different kinds of language, different kinds of concerns, different ways of attending, different focus ways of focusing as expressing different social perspectives. It's to say language is it's always encapsulated in a certain kind of perspectival bubble. We see the language of Austen's characters embedded in Austen's narrative. Um, uh, it is always expresses a certain kind of social ideological bubble. Um, a certain worldview is always encapsulated in the language that people speak, and then the way in which the narrator echoes that language even without quoting it. So, in the famous first line of Pride and Prejudice, we can see the bubble of the worldview of someone like Mrs. Bennet, um, and even more complexly, we can see the ironic mockery of that worldview in the precision of the language, the way in which those first words are a little too subtle, little too clever for Miss Bennet herself actually to say. Probably they sound something more like Elizabeth would say in making fun of her mother. And in fact, that's how the BBC version, that's one of the first lines in the BBC version, we hear Elizabeth mocking her mom by saying those words, mocking her mother's excitement over Bingley's arrival in town. So that's what we're getting instructed in as we read the novel. We might not be able to read these multi-layer perspectives in the first line, the first time we read the first line of Pride and Prejudice, but as we read through the novel, we become attentive to. We're instructed in. We're given an ability to read these social conflicts in the expressions, in the individual expressions of particular characters. So that makes us this ability to read history, historical conflicts in the expressions of the moment. This being able to read at least double, two levels of meaning. It's me expressing myself now, or a particular character expressing themselves now. But through this expression, through my conversation, my relationships, larger historical forces, generalizable conflicts, a larger story is playing itself out through my particular experiences and actions. So the historical conflict that Jane Austen is concerned about is summed up in the title, Pride and Prejudice. The conflict between the pride of traditional aristocracy, nobility, inherited nobility, and the prejudice, the judgmental, the assertion of judgment and taste, this new consumerist sensibility represented by the middle class, the professional nouveau riche, that are mingling with the, increasingly mingling with the nobility, with the expansion of capitalism. So that has to do with language. The difference between Pride and Prejudice is played out in language. The way in which Darcy doesn't need to speak for himself, and the Bennets maybe say too much, that it's embarrassing. And so that's a important and helpful way of looking at Blake. Blake is concerned with the historical forces unleashed by the democratic revolutions in the U.S. and France, and is exploring that freedom, that new kind of historical force, through language, through his art. He, like Austin, wants to create a new kind of reader. He's creating a new kind of writing, a new kind of art, inventing his own printing methods, inventing a whole new form of publication, distribution of literature and artwork. He's really like a modern hipster in a way. Like it's all about do it yourself. He wants to control the means of production, to make the means of production of his art themselves creative. He doesn't want to passively receive that, but make them. So that's to say, he's wildly ambitious in terms of his aspiration to create new forms of communication, of mediation, of his historical forces, historical new ideologies, and in particular the ideology of freedom. So I think it's helpful to consider a definition of freedom made by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He considers, in a book called Four Essays on Liberty, the distinction between positive and negative freedom or liberty. It's really helpful in general because they're concepts that often get it blurred. So it's basically the distinction between freedom to do something positive. I'm free to say something, do something. This is the purpose of my freedom is to do something in particular, versus freedom from, like freedom from censorship or freedom from imprisonment. We tend to think about in liberal society, we tend to emphasize freedom from, and we tend to define freedom in terms of rights. So you have the right to, bodily self-determination, to not be censored. That's to say, you have the right to not be interfered with. These are definitions of freedom in terms of being free from encumbrances, limitations on yourself. This is different from the kind of freedom that's usually emphasized by traditionalists like Edmund Burke, who say that freedom from is empty freedom, purposeless freedom. It leaves us without direction. We rely on tradition and culture, positive cultural values, to give our freedom purpose. To tell us what's worth doing. So that's a complex relationship and that I think is helpful in looking at understanding what's going on in Blake. Blake's ambition was not just to carve out a certain free space free from encumbrance or censorship or limitation. He wanted to fill that space with demonstrate the purpose of individual freedom. Um, so that's to say that now that individuals do not rely on the church or the king to hierarchically transmit downward the what counts as true and good, the purpose of life. Now that individuals are left to their own to define what's true and good. It's what Blake is all about, is emphasizing that's not just like empty free time to like just entertain. The point of freedom is not just to like, do whatever you feel like, to just kind of while away your time. But to express, to creatively assert and express the authority that the monarch and the prophet, the religious prophet, used to express. So he wants to create readers that are fluent and responsive to a kind of prophetic language, so that he wants to create readers that have not just gone beyond the authority of the king and the pope, but have assumed that authority for themselves, and are creatively exploring that for themselves. So his Jerusalem ends by correlating the here and now with biblical time. One of his most famous, the best summation, I think, of Blake's outlook is his proverb from hell: eternity is in love with the productions of time. The Henry David Thoreau put it another way: you can't kill time without injuring eternity. So that's to say that now that we no longer have to obey the king and the church or heed what the king and the church tell us are our ultimate destiny, the purpose of our lives, and the hereafter. Now we have to say that for ourselves. We have to articulate that for ourselves. That's to say, eternity is at stake in our own, what we do with our time. Our day-to-day experience of time is not just empty time to ourselves, but is an occasion to explore what eternity means, what the absolute means, what we used to think about in terms of God. So that's what Blake is exploring here. He's the connection between eternity and the here and now. Did those feet, the feet of the Lord, in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? So, just it's a more intense exploration of Austen's juxtaposition of pride and prejudice, the sort of absolute pride and authority of nobility butting up against the new middle class aspirations and judgment and activity. Um, uh, but Blake is just putting this in starker, more radical terms. Um, so, did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here among these satanic mills? So, again, like in the Tiger, he's looking at the factory production, the mills, um, in biblical terms. Seeing the absolute stakes of religion at stake in the here and now, and therefore assuming that responsibility in the act of writing. And so he finishes here with evoking his instruments of writing, the organ of expression, the means of his production, the tools of his expression, as instruments of divinity. Arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariots of fire. For I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we build Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. This portrait, I can't help thinking of the sword in his hand. He's, obviously talking about his pen or his paintbrush. These are the tools of the eternal that he is claiming to exercise here. And I can't, there's something ironic, I think, here in the way this pen is like, it's applied to himself in this portrait. It's as if he's writing himself, and that's if that's fair to say, that's a very apt irony, I think, for his writing. That's exactly what he's saying, and in this passage, it's our responsibility to build to undertake the mental fight and to actively build. The mental fight is a literary fight, a discursive fight, to realize the eternal in the here and now, of the actual contemporary England. So for Blake, like for Austen, this mental fight, activating a new kind of attention, a new ability to read, historical forces in the here and now. It means dismantling binary oppositions, pride and prejudice, innocence and experience. These conceptual black and white, good and evil, body and soul, dismantling them, because these are abstractions, like eternal and temporal, infinite and finite. These binaries are ways of keeping the transcendent meaning and the experience of the here and now apart. He wants to bring them together. I think that's what Austen also is doing. She's bringing them together. in bringing Darcy and Lizzie together, she's mediating, intermediating these this historical conflict, this conflict of historical forces, and that's what Blake is all about. Um, uh, and there's something very very deep about that. It's and related to the romantic philosophical concern with what's called dialectics, or he also talks about in terms of contraries. Um, Actual history is always about mediating. Our historical life is always about mediating. Um, Dialectically mediating. Dialectic means like a conversation, dialogue, um, conceptual oppositions that are helpful for understanding for negotiating our world, but are helpful, like language generally, only in virtue of simplifying. Um, so learning about the world means finding the overlap and synthesis, what dialectical philosophy talks about, the synthesis of the thesis and the antithesis. Um, so good and evil. We get a more complex view of how they're actually intertwined by paying attention to real history, real life. That's what novels do for us, is they give us particular lives and show us how our abstract understanding that we might have in psychology or sociology, how these abstract concepts um, uh, uh, leave out, lack the kind of subtle intelligence or wisdom. Wisdom is a key term. Practical knowledge is wisdom about how things play out in the messy details of actual life. Okay, so we see in Blake always this concern for binaries, this separation, this creator um, uh, um, d- dividing the worlds, heaven and hell, good and evil. He's exploring how the ironies of their overlap. Um, so, in actual human experience, there's always this kind of mediation of two sides. In our mythology, in the stories we tell are always about this interplay of two sides. So he refers to as contraries, symmetries, various kinds of binary oppositions. And just think about how fundamental, foundational they are in your experience of life. I just mentioned, positive and negative liberty. It's a technical, philosophical distinction, but you can think about all these different ways we distinguish between public and private, individual and society. More philosophically, we distinguish between substance and accident. Who I really am, and then my accidental expressions or appearance, truth versus appearance, private versus public, child, adult, body, soul, feeling, reason, woman, man, hell, heaven, evil, good. We're always doing this in order to negotiate the world. And I think it's related. A helpful way of thinking about it, I might have already mentioned, is in terms of what's called arborization, the way in which biological forms in general bifurcate. The leaf forms by bifurcating, responding to the environment, and assuming those fractal shapes that I was talking about earlier. So we uh, interact with the environment by applying these sorts of oppositions and having them mediated by experience. So another way of talking about binary oppositions is in terms of the excluded middle. You're either one or the other. Whereas what literature gives us, attending to the accidental details of life, gives us the mediation, the middle, mediating between the contrasts. So in Blake, this plays out in terms of oppositions between the mechanically passive, objective, what Blake calls ratio, it's a reason, rationality, or empirical sense, knowledge. The idea that we passively receive information from the objective world through our senses, versus this organically interactive, subjective reading of experience, reading of the world, mediation of the world through our experience. So think about this in terms of the clod and the pebble, which I've already talked about. There we see clearly contrasted all these concepts, heaven and hell, selfish versus compassion, and so on. These are ideological oppositions that form the lens through which experience is mediated. So I hear compassion somehow in the sound of the clod getting trampled, or I hear selfishness in the sound of the pebble in the brook. That's what the poet says. The poet affirms this ideology in that poem. He's saying the pebble is selfish. It sings a selfish song. The clod represents the compassion of self-sacrifice. But on a deeper level, the irony of the poem is that we recognize, no, they're kind of interrelated. If we actually think about the clod and the pebble, what is a clod once it's trampled? It's not even there anymore. What is the sound of the pebble in the brook? It's not the pebble, it's the brook around it. And maybe what is a clod that's trampled? Maybe that turns into something hard like a pebble. So what my mind is holding apart in these binary contrasts, my sense experience, if I pay attention to it, reveals a complexity of organic interaction that belies that simplicity. And that has to do with music. The music of the poem. He's teaching us about reading. He's teaching about what these meters meet, these appropriate this appropriate song, the meters, the measures of the poem are appropriate um, to the meaning, to this deeper meaning that the concepts espoused by the poem, heaven and hell, selfish and selfless, um, don't accommodate. Uh, this drawing called the duck rabbit illusion is helpful for understanding what I'm talking about, the difference between poetry and the concepts ostensibly espoused in the poem. Uh, Heaven and hell, selfish and selfless. Um, uh, so, you can look at this picture one way and see a duck. Look at it the other way, left to right or right to left, see a duck or see a rabbit. But you can't see both at the same time. Same thing in the Clod and the Pebble. He's like, he's saying you can't. We've got two rubrics. We've got two concepts, a sort of ideological lens that's organizing our experience. But what music does is confuse that stability. Like this illusion, it draws us into an ability not to see them both at the same time, but to toggle back and forth in a musical with a kind of musical rhythm. The meter, the measure, the mediation of these two static concepts. So that's drawing us into a wisdom of actual life. It's like a musical awareness, a wisdom of the way things play out, the way things happen in a world like ours. Not pretending platonically to see things from above in this timeless way, which ends up treating, like in The Fly, ends up treating our actual experience of time as meaningless. In a body, bodies don't matter, like flies don't matter. All that matters are timeless thought and knowledge. What transcends the temporal world, that Platonic view. But what the poem does, drawing us into its contradictions. What is a body that doesn't matter? What does it mean to read a poem, to experience the bodily effects of music, and at the same time say the body is meaningless and doesn't matter? What does it mean to dance and sing? What are dancing and singing if the body is arbitrarily meaningless? So that's a kind of a way in which poetry, music address the question of wisdom, practical knowledge applied to the weird, irreducibly weird circumstances of actual life. And that's not just what poetry is about, but that's what literature in general about, is paying attention to what's otherwise appear only as accidental, random, giving it a kind of artistic coherence, a temporal rhythm, like Austin's emphasis on the motif of dance and music. Remember, musical performance is a sort of thematic motif of Lizzie and Darcy's love affair. The pride in Pride and Prejudice is exemplified not just by Darcy's arrogance, but also by Mr. Collins's presumption, his entitlement to Lizzie. Um, the way his proposal to Lizzie is correlated, compared by Austen to a kind of suffocation. He silences her. He doesn't just refuse to hear her refusals. He reads them, uh, coercively forces them to be read, forces her, um, into saying, into being, um, enacting a consent. So he's reading her no's as yes, and that's, um, an expression of his patriarchal entitlement, the same, uh, alignment of male privilege with the law that we see in the entail, the way the inheritance is entailed away, from the women. Um, uh, so this is a similar correlation of, what we were just talking about in Blake, the, um, transcendent ideology of, good and bad, heaven and hell, um, the ideology of patriarchy, um, is used coercively, violently to, disregard, I, actual experience, in the actual embodied experience of an Elizabeth who's saying, I am a rational creature with a voice speaking truth from my heart. That experience of an actual speaking agent is getting violently, um, crushed. Um, so here's the way Blake, talks about this. Um, he uh, tells a story about how ideologies, got established. He imagines that, uh, in the beginning, in pagan, culture, pre-Christian culture, um, uh, in, animistic, religions that saw the environment animated with spirits, or mythological, um, uh, uh, cultures that saw various pagan, gods, um, uh, animating the actual temporal worlds. And so saw the temporal world, that is, as mediating, the kind of transcendent, meanings that, gods represent. So that's, what he's talking about here, in that, ancient poets are, speak, pagan, mythology. The ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by the names and adorning them with the properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their enlarged and numerous senses could perceive. So the intertwining of body and soul, meaning and sensation are intermediated. Um, they studied the genius of each city and country, placing it under its mental deity, till a system was formed, which some took advantage of, and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Thus began priesthood. So, he's sort of saying the same thing, that, our, concepts petrify, get abstracted. We stop paying attention to actual life, and, subordinate the authority of actual experience to the static reality dictated by concepts. Jane Austen, I mentioned before, and it begins Persuasion with this discussion of the patriarch's obsession with this book, the Baronetcy, that codifies patriarchy in a way. Just lists all the patriarchs. That's sort of the distinction between that book and Austen's novel is the distinction Blake is drawing here between the pagan poetry of an animated environment and the dogmatism, the static dogma, orthodoxy of the priesthood. The dogma that is abstracted from temporal life and used to manipulate and control temporal life. Thus men forgot that deities reside in the human breast. This in a way, so Blake is trying to remind us of this like prophetic power of poetry to explore the meanings in temporal life and sensuous experience. But I want to suggest, although Austen, in a way, in her domestic comedy of manners, is so small scale compared to Blake's visionary prophecies. It's formally the same thing. They're both looking at the way in which they're both paying attention to the details of life, of actual temporal life, in order to instruct us, give us a wisdom more complex and dynamic than dogmatic understanding. Hence what Blake says here, without contraries is no progression. That holds for novels too. Novels are about conflict, and Pride and Prejudice, a big part of that is mediating that that binary, that contrast, and pushing history forward through that mediation. So going back to the question of freedom, the new democratic individuality that Blake is most motivated to explore and affirm. Look at this representation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which can be traced back to the French Revolution. I like how it's correlated with music in this video, and they use. I talked about fractals before, and the way in which an actual experience details emerge that defy static representation. That's what a fractal picture is always trying to represent, how the complexity of any representation the more and more accurate it is, it will eventually break through to a fractal of a larger dimension. And this video beautifully suggests something similar in the way it's always collapsing or expanding to different scales, different dimensions of perception. So you'll see what I'm talking about. The point I want to make is simple, that the rights, abstract rights, what the abstract definition sort of negative freedom. You are free from interference by other authorities. What that means always has to be applied in somehow a positive way in actual life. What it means to have free speech has to be tested against actual speech. That application of the abstract concept to the here and now. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. Is what's evoked by the music, I think, and the rhythm, and I just think it's a helpful example for thinking about what Blake's trying to do with his art, what the poetry is doing, what literary form generally is doing, including in prose like Austin's. To say that there's no progress without contraries, Blake interprets that as satanic. That's a strong way of, a direct way of putting it. But Satan is the adversary. It means antagonism. So that's what I'm saying basically about Austen's novel, is that it's about the antagonisms, conflicts, ironies of the particular accidents and details of lived experience. But again, Blake takes it to this extreme of. But I want you to understand the logic of it. that it has to do with the assertion of the value of the here and now against the authority of transcendent, static concepts. There's always something adversarial about that, asserting myself, acting now. The Romantic philosophers talked about action in general as negative, as adversarial. If I'm the world as I receive it is there, it's given. It's a positive presence. I'm by asserting myself, by acting in the world, I'm interfering. I'm changing, making some kind of negative effect on what I find, what's received in the world. The Romantics, explore this in all sorts of different ways. Just the awareness of my mind, the freedom of my mind, the activity of my mind is always distinguishing myself from the world around me. You'll read soon Wordsworth's Nutting, where he talks about listening to the sound of a stream, and he says he hears the murmur and the murmuring sound. So I hear the murmur and the murmuring sound. There's even as I codify what I hear with the word murmur, which really isn't even a concept, it's just onomatopoeia, it's just a mimicry. I even in that moment, my mind goes beyond the word, and so murmur isn't quite right. It's the murmuring sound beyond each moment. The experience is always moving, flowing. So this experience of time has something satanic about it, and there's a rebellious assertion of my own freedom. So that's, it can sound abstract and philosophical, but it's helpful for getting at what there's a reason for behind Blake's infernal method and his emphasis on I'm speaking from the perspective of time. I mean, he's being consistent with Christian orthodoxy in a way. We live in a fallen world, a world of sin. We're exiled from paradise. We speak of heaven, we think we know what that means, we speak of good, but that we're always in a way lying because we live in a imperfect world. So that's why he's always aligning his activity, his energy. Activity is, there's something essentially at odds with orthodox conceptions of true and good. It's also a rebellion against Bibles, sacred codes, the ways in which goodness is holds steady and static. Empire, the marriage in heaven and hell, ends by saying empire. The age of empire is over. The age of freedom, of action, self-realization is here. Again, he's working through this in terms of all these, deconstructing all these oppositions. So all the Bibles and Orthodox rules have the following errors: that man has two existing principles, body and soul, that energy, called evil, is the body, that reason is good, is from the soul, that God will torment man in eternity for following his energies. He's saying that that's all self-imprisonment, that's all lies, mind-forged manacles. The truth of the matter is paradoxical, is ironical. Man has no body distinct from his soul. So that's, he's conflating oppositional terms. There's no way to read that, but ironically, but that's the condition of liberation, of actual freedom in the world. So that body is a portion of soul discerned by the five senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. That's key. So he has a historical sense that we live in an age of empirical rationality. So that's how we codify the body. We turn the soul into, turn the body into soul, into meaning through empirical rationality that articulates the experience of the five senses in objective descriptions of experience. But energy, activity, this infinite flow and newness of experience in every moment is the only life, and is from the body, and reason is bound or outward circumference of energy. Energy is eternal delight. Those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. Again, it's functional definition. The restrained desire isn't an effect of restraint. It's an effect of lack of desire, lack of energy. A thing is what it does. And this is correlated with poetry, and coming back to music, one of his most famous statements in all of Blake's writing is this point about Milton, Paradise Lost. I was just talking about exile from paradise, living in the temporal fallen world, and Blake says here, Milton, he's pretends to be pious, to be updating the story of Adam and Eve for modernity, and it being faithful, orthodox, but his poetry is on the side of Satan. He writes much better about Satan than he does about the angels and God, and so Blake's saying he illustrates the same point, that music is on the side of the wisdom of temporal life, the joy, exuberance, delight in actual embodied experience of time. And that's always contradicting and antagonizing orthodox meaning.